here. It's truly a sea of humanity out here across the room, and it's wonderful to see. I'd like to think about what the New York Preservation Archive Project is all about. And as I thought about that, I realized what we are doing. If you've ever had a teacher who, in the past, long ago, corrected you for using the passive voice in a sentence, or maybe you had someone correct you yesterday for using the passive voice. I think what NIPAP does, it tries to remind you and encourage you, not quite like that teacher long ago, but as a friend, encourage you to think about historic preservation in the active voice. Historic preservationists saved that building. Historic preservationists saved that neighborhood rather than the neighborhood was saved or the building was saved. What we do as an organization through oral histories, through saving papers and collections, through programming, and through all sorts of other activity is try to make sure that the story of preservationists, all of their efforts, the action, the long, hard slogs that all of you have been involved in are somehow not forgotten. Because there are a lot of people out there, many people whose story has not been shared or told in the broader preservation movement, who have been out there working just as hard. So today is a chance for us to lift up some very fine examples of folks who have been out there doing that work. I want to say a special thanks also to our two lead sponsors for this event today, the J.M. Kaplan Fund, who's very graciously helped bring us a great speaker today. And also our friends at the Greenwood Cemetery, which, as you all know by this point, has become so much more than a cemetery and has really become an arts and cultural hub for the city. So thank you both. And I do want to say one last thing here before we get underway, is if you look on your name tag, that little smudge that you might see there is actually a tiny little image of one Elbert Bard. The reason we are here today, Elbert Bard, of course, was the one, and I might be stealing some of Tony Wood's thunder here. Elbert Bard was the one back in the 50s who worked for decades to finally pass legislation at the state level that allowed New York City to have its own landmarks law. So a very pivotal figure in the preservation movement. But without further ado, I am going to introduce to you the chairman and founder of the New York Preservation Archive Project, Mr. Anthony C. Wood.
Thank you, Brad, our wonderful executive director. He did omit one of the key missions of the Archive Project, which is to make sure preservationists get up early one day a year and have a good breakfast. And we deliver on that. Last year, we started a new tradition of making it possible for a modest additional donation to name a table after an inspirational preservationist. So we have a wonderful roster of those people's names that I want to call out as part of reminding us of some of the great preservationists of the past and of the present. So the roster of greats: Albert Bard, the grandfather of our landmarks law; Helena Rosenthal, the best friend the Upper East Side ever had; Tom Bess of Longwood and Harlem fame. Yes. Feel free to applaud for your favorite preservationist. Eric Allison, citywide historic district advocate. Dorothy Miner, preservation lawyer extraordinaire. Clay Lancaster, the great architectural historian of Brooklyn Heights. Henry Hope Reed, champion of all things classical. Jane Jacobs, a lady who launched a movement. Bill Bora, who saved the French Quarter from Robert Moses. George McEnany, there we go, the McEnany table, who's joined on my lapel with Albert Bard, the preserver of Federal Hall in Castle Clinton. Nancy Pearsall, a landmarks lioness. Ada Louise Huxtable, who relentlessly sounded the clarion call for our landmarks law. Whitney North Seymour Jr., an unceasing civic champion. And we have a special table, the Foo Table, Friends of Otis. But it's not a foo table, it's a foo room. Everybody here today is a friend of Otis. If any of those names are unfamiliar to you, ask one of us about it or visit our website, because that's partially what we're here to do, is keep those legacies alive. It's now my pleasure to turn the mic over to someone who's in the business of both honoring the departed and celebrating the living. Our board member who has brought Greenwood Cemetery to life as a vibrant historic and cultural site, Rich Moylan.
Hate following that guy. Good morning, everyone. It's indeed an honor and a great pleasure to be able to introduce my friend Otis Pearsall today. Looking out at this sold-out crowd, really beginning to wonder if Fred and Jeff Wilpon made the right decision selling the Mets to Stephen A. Cohen. I think they should have sold it to Otis. Otis fills these seats every time. I'm really a relative newbie when it comes to Otis Pratt Pearsall. I only met him for the first time in December of 1992 when he was elected to the board of Greenwood Cemetery, where he still sits today, still an inspiration and mentor to me, and always supportive of all of Greenwood's preservation efforts. Otis has been honored by all of the preservation organizations in New York at least once. So why again? We all know his history of preservation advocacy, and I have no time, Tony made sure of that, to go through that laundry list anyway. But he's still getting the job done 54 years after the enactment of the New York City Landmarks Law. Just last year, when the wrangling over the fate of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway erupted, questions arose as to whether the Brooklyn Heights Promenade was actually a protected part of the Brooklyn Heights Historic District. Like the solid barrister he is, Otis was able to prove decisively that the promenade lies within the boundaries of the protected district by proffering documents from his own extensive archives, including exhibits from 1962, 64, 65, 76, and 1993, to prove his point. Original maps, press releases, letters, and written recollections were key materials to ensure that the Landmarks Preservation Commission was to be consulted regarding any changes to the beloved promenade. This is exactly what the This is exactly what we at Preservation Archives want you to do with your papers today. Organize them so they continue to be used to safeguard our city's heritage long into the future. Otis is a meticulous record keeper, and his records tell the story of more than half a century of preservation efforts, his and Nancy's, and that of many others, including the good number of people here with us today. Otis's records are important because they are not dusty records stored in an attic or in a pile. They are a usable archive regularly called upon to help settle a current controversy or question. Otis has been on the board of the Preservation Archive Project for more than a decade, and we're sad to see him go. But we're very grateful to have this opportunity to honor him today. Today, Otis will be receiving the Archive Project's Preservation Award, a lovely hunk of bronze cast not far from Greenwood Cemetery's main entrance. Otis stands as a shining example for all concerned with historic preservation. His efforts to save, organize, and share the knowledge he has accumulated continues to inspire new generations of preservationists. He's an example for us all. Ladies and gentlemen, Otis Pratt Pearsall.
It's real bronze. It's not plastic. Incredible. Well, thank you, Rich. Those are wonderful thoughts. I wish they were all 100% true, but in any event, and thanks to the Archive Project for this really quite splendid looking medal. And to all of you for coming out at this amazing hour. Well, for years, I've envied the luck of my predecessors in receiving one of these medals. It's very handsome. And now I have one for my very own. This is great. But I am profoundly mindful that I'm not getting it for any substantive success, but instead for my proclivities as the prototypical preservation pack rat. Now, I'm guilty as charged, of course, but where others may look at my four-drawer file cabinet with its rows of Redwells neatly labeled by Preservation Project and think of it as the repository for just a lot of old paper, I see it as jam-packed with wonderful stories waiting to leap out. Now, our fearless leader, Tony Wood, certainly found a gold mine when he was writing his amazing book, Preserving New York. And to make the point of how valuable some old paper can turn out to be, I brought along a couple of unassuming looking pieces of scrap paper. To illustrate the point. Although Albert Bard, for whom of course we do these sumptuous breakfasts, actually achieved enactment of his now celebrated law in 1956, it somehow was allowed to languish in the shadow, unused, unexploited, essentially ignored until January 1959, when this very piece of paper, the actual piece of paper, arrived amidst a care package from the National Trust. And that enabled it, a month later, to burst from obscurity permanently in this very Brooklyn Heights Press article, original being displayed now, carefully protected by plastic cover. In this Brooklyn Heights Press article, is anybody here associated with the Brooklyn Heights Press? Entitled, Ask Historic Zoning for the Heights. That was the beginning. But, you know, Tony did mine a ton of good stories from those earliest files. But his cutoff was the 1965 enactment of the Landmarks Law. And since then, so many good stories have happened and are happening all the time, even now. And they need to be preserved. And that's what this organization is all about promoting. From my Redwells, of which I have innumerable, come many, many stories from the later periods. To whet your appetite, of course, I'm now going to just mention a few of them. Gaining the amendment of the city zoning resolution to authorize limited height districts in designated historic districts. Now, that was achieved with the invaluable help of two city planning commissioners in particular. One, Beverly Moss Spatt, who was spotted making the rounds at age 95 just the other night at the landmark Lion event. We all should be like that. And Harmon Goldstone, both of them were then city planning commissioners, making possible the development of modern Dumbo by defeating Mayor Lindsay's 1968 plan to move the Fort Greene wholesale meat market, if you can believe this, to the East River between the Brooklyn Bridge and Main Street, together with, of course, the rodents and the smells and the trucks and so forth. Well, more about that in just a moment. Rescuing the Empire Stores and the Tobacco Warehouse through my colleague Scott Hand's initiative to designate the Fulton Ferry Empire Stores Historic District, and then to follow through by persuading Governor Carey to purchase the site for a state park. Arresting the Port Authority's 1985 plan for the private development of a mini city on the piers below Brooklyn Heights by proposing as the alternative a somewhat more attractive possibility, Brooklyn Bridge Park. And as a final example of what can be found in these red wells, rescuing Brooklyn's own skyscraper row along Court Street from the frenzied redevelopment of downtown Brooklyn through the designation of the Borough Hall Skyscraper Historic District. Now, by my count, it's worth holding on to these documents. At least 5 books have tapped the resources of that file cabinet, and I know of more in the pipeline. But before any of you rush out to write the book on the Borough Hall Skyscraper Historic District, you should know that apart from my file cabinet, a crucial resource will be the archive of Stephen Levin, who was key, his leadership was key to the hard-fought city council approval. I'm very glad to say that my assemblywoman, Joanne Simon, is here with her redoubtable husband, Bill Harris. She has been shoulder to shoulder with us through so much. And I am very pleased also that my remarkable wife, is she here somewhere? Who was one of the original bands from 1958, fall of 1958, that got this whole preservation thing going, and is responsible for far more of the content of those red wells and all those archives than has generally been recognized. Now, should there be any doubters out there as to the power of a preservation archive to reveal truth, I'd like to tell you a short story about how the rip-roaring Dumbo that we know today would never have existed it would not exist in its present form had it not been for the intervention of Ada Louise Huxtable. Now, last spring, I had the pleasure of a sit-down with the author of a forthcoming biography of Ada Louise, with whom I had served on the board of the Municipal Art Society and whose path had crossed with mine in any number of ventures over the years. Well, reviewing with that author the archive on Mayor Lindsay's plan sprung on us in October of '68 to move the Fort Greene wholesale meat market to the East River. It's just hard to get that in your heads, but that's what he had in mind doing. I was able to demonstrate, document by document, how with the close support of her very, very good friend Norval White, we had reached out to her for help, and she had become an engaged ally. In addition to authoring 2 critical New York Times editorials, she let loose with the killer full-length feature story entitled "New York, Life's Loser Does It Again." Just days before the Brooklyn Heights Press reported that Lindsay had run up the white flag. Well, you know, I'm sure that our wonderful lawsuit, we had a wonderful lawsuit, and we did political maneuvering, and we had this wonderful alliance with the Municipal Art Society and its towering president, Charlie Hughes, and I'm sure they all had their roles. But the clincher was clearly that killer article by Ada Louise Huxtable that made all the difference and made the possibility of today's Dumbo, which you can hardly imagine would have been able to be done if the wholesale meat market with its rodents, did I mention this before, the rodents, and so forth. Anyway, it was great fun to uncork this wholly unknown story of Dumbo's debt to Ada Louise Huxtable. And what a powerful testimonial to the importance of preserving an archive without which this wonderful story would never be known. Thanks again to the Archive Project for this marvelous award. This is not plastic, and you can all come and have a look. Thank you all for turning out. It's amazing. We've got a packed room at this hour. Thank you.
Moylan said it was difficult following Tony. I don't know what you do when you're sandwiched in between Otis and the speaker I'm about to introduce and the speaker he will introduce in a moment. So thank you everybody for coming, as always. As Otis says, we preservationists are hardy people. We can be here for an 8:15 breakfast, even on a gridlock alert day in December in New York City. So with no further ado, I am going to introduce Brent Leggs, who I have had the great pleasure to know for more than a decade in my role as an advisor to the National Trust for New York State. And I think the greatest thing that I can say about Brent, and I'm not going to say anything in his bio because it's in our program, but I will say that the greatest thing I can say about almost everybody in this room I know is that I've learned so much over the years. And I doubt Brent remembers our first substantive conversation that was about a decade ago about the John Coltrane House in Dix Hills. But it was one of those instructive moments where it was being considered at the time for some funding from the National Trust. And as an advisor, You know, I wrote a very lukewarm response because I didn't doubt the importance of the house, but I questioned its viability as a potential public venue. And Brent picked up the phone and really had an important conversation with me that made me think differently about the challenges and sometimes the challenges we have to overcome. So it's a great pleasure to introduce him this morning because that was just the beginning of a great program that he really undertook, which now has a real shape and form at the National Trust under the banner of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. So I am going to introduce Brent and thank him for coming this morning.
Good morning, everyone. There are moments in one's career where you are honored to stand before an audience like this to recognize a grassroots leader and champion in the U.S. preservation movement. It is my honor to share brief remarks about the legend, Miss Priscilla Cooper. So preservation, in essence, is really about people, and it's about stories. So I want to tell you how I first was connected to Priscilla. So in the spring of 2015, Priscilla hosted a meeting with the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. That meeting included Priscilla, myself, and Dr. Deborah Mack. Priscilla was there to raise the alarm that the city of Birmingham had proposed the partial demolition of one of the most important civil rights landmarks, arguably in the world, called the A.G. Gaston Motel. The city had invested 4 years, created a development plan, a new construction that they called the Freedom Center, and had bonded $10 million to fund that project. But thanks to Priscilla's engagement, advocacy, and leadership, and in partnership with Congresswoman Terry Sewell, Mayor William Bell, and the grassroots stakeholders at 16th Street Baptist Church, Bethel Baptist Church, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and so many others, that today the A.G. Gaston Motel is currently under restoration, and it is the centerpiece of the newly created Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument, which President Obama designated the last week before he left office. That is just one example that demonstrates the power of preservation leaders and how we can form partnerships to advocate on behalf of our nation's diverse historic places. Priscilla, today you join the ranks of Pamela Cummings, who was the leader behind the first grassroots preservation project to preserve the home of George Washington, Mount Vernon. You join the ranks of Mary Talbert, who, as the president of the National Association of Colored Women, led a national campaign to preserve the home of Frederick Douglass in Washington, D.C. And that effort birthed the Black National Preservation Movement. You join the ranks of Congresswoman Terry Sewell, Joan Maynard, who founded Wheatsville. Felicia Rashad, who is the co-chair of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, and so many others. So I am delighted to welcome to the stage the legend, Miss Priscilla Cooper.
got mine. Good morning, everyone. Lisa just asked me if I needed a 5-minute warning. So I have my phone, I have my watch, because this is a story that has a lot of layers, and I'm delighted to be able to share it with you this morning. Congratulations. Where'd he go? Mr. Oh, there he is. To Mr. Otis Pearsall. And I related to everything that you said. So this morning, Brett has asked me to particularly talk about the role of archives with the work we're doing in Alabama. And yes, it is delightful to see all of you up, bright-eyed. You've killed all the stereotypes about archivists being kind of dull and stodgy. You're a lively group. And I'm thrilled and honored to be here with you this morning. When is historic preservation a radical concept? When it gives voice to a people whose history has been erased from the text of human memory and the terrain of our physical landscape. Although the historic preservation movement in this country is decades old, we know that there are certain places and stories that have not been included. And I applaud my friend and colleague Brent in being one of the earliest advocates and voices for preservation of African American historic sites. Brent has been toiling in this vineyard for a long time. What's in the name? We have a long one. The Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium. We have been trying to figure out how to shorten it, but every word means something. Alabama is kind of obvious. We are really focused on sites in the state of Alabama. African American is key because all of these places were developed, nurtured by the African American community. There are other significant civil rights sites, say a Greyhound bus station in Montgomery, that are not included because this effort is specifically dedicated to the preservation and uplift of these sites that often are unknown, are little known. Heritage sites, oh, civil rights, that's right. Civil rights, see, I even forget the name. Civil rights, because that is the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s is what resonates in our current history and memory. However, we say heritage sites because part of our goal is also to expand that narrative to increase the country's understanding, the nation's understanding of this movement that didn't just begin in 1950. These places have been part of the struggle for Black freedom since Reconstruction, and one of them actually was founded prior to the end of the Civil War. So there's a long legacy here and stories that are truly unknown. Consortium, because we are a collective group of sites that had not previously worked together. These sites are located in civil rights cities that are key to the movement and to the legacy of civil rights legislation in this country. And I like to show this because people who are not from Alabama really don't understand how far apart they are. So we have Birmingham, which is in central Alabama, Montgomery, which is also the state capital, which gives it another whole flavor. And it's also home of the first White House of the Confederacy, Selma. And then we have two kind of outliers that are part of the Black Belt, Whitehall in Lowndes County and Greensboro. These are iconic cities, and I would be remiss not to mention our dynamic sponsors. This effort began with an email from David Stocks at the Educational Foundation of America to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute about the potential for nominating civil rights sites in the state of Alabama to the World Monuments Fund watch. We weren't familiar with any of these things, but along with EFA, recognized the importance and the opportunity, even though we really didn't appreciate the potential impact all of this would have. And I always say I've never worked with funders like these. David Stocks also reached out to the J.M. Kaplan Fund, which has been such an important partner with us in this work. So in February of 2017, we called together representatives from sites throughout the state. This was the first time many of these people had met each other, the first time we had gotten together to talk about this nomination and the process. And it was such a moving experience. Number one, they were so excited that somebody even cared. These are people who have been laboring, as I say, toiling in this vineyard of preservation with little to no resources, working as volunteers because of their passion and their commitment. Three things really came out of that as a shared vision. The importance of preserving these historic buildings. These are places of worship, 75% of them are churches, lodging and civic engagement, private homes and hotels. To collect and preserve the stories, as Otis mentioned, and archives is such an important part of that process, and to engage young people, to engage that next generation, because frankly, the civil rights generation, we are rapidly losing them. And archives, documentation, really plays into all three of these goals. So on your table, you have a brochure that has photographs and a little information about each of the sites, but I still wanted to share them so we could look at them collectively. Stories. The Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church, which is where Dr. King pastored in Montgomery, actually sits at the foot of the state capitol. The first time I went, I said, oh, no wonder they were mad. But it also is on the site of a former slave pen, a holding pen for enslaved people. Montgomery was a major area for the slave trade. That's the story that is seldom told, and our historian has found the paperwork that shows that this property was sold to an African-American man, and our question is, ooh, who was he mad at that he sold that property to some black people in the 1800s? So, you know, that's part of the archival mystery and search. The Richard Harris House is an example. These are both privately owned properties, but the Harris House is where the Freedom Riders, after they had been attacked by the mob at the bus station, this is where they were sheltered. First Baptist Brickaday Church was pastored by Reverend Ralph Abernathy. It's called Brickaday because when they were rebuilding, the pastor said, you know, they're doing a lot of construction all around the city, so as you come to the church, just pick up a brick. So people brought a brick a day. Trinity, the parsonage was the home of Reverend William Gretz, who was a white Lutheran minister who was called to pastor a black congregation in Montgomery and worked with the Montgomery Improvement Association. Old Ship sits right across the street from the new EJI lynching memorial. Jackson Community House, the first time I went here, I thought I was lost because through the efforts of the Federated Women's Clubs, this house was preserved, and it sits in the middle of all of these state buildings. The State Retirement Systems of Alabama had a very aggressive, shall we say, building program. So I was looking at the state building and said, this has to be wrong. But there it sits, and it's a lovely building. Okay, there we go. Birmingham Historic Bethel was pastored by Reverend Shuttlesworth, the leader of the Birmingham movement, and as was mentioned, was bombed several times. Most of you are familiar with the iconic 16th Street Baptist Church, which had a long history, but is remembered by most in this country as the site of the bombing in 1963 that killed 4 girls. The Ballard House is an example of another privately owned property, and their mission is really to tell this earlier story that we're so interested in. Brown Chapel, if you saw Selma, the movie, or have seen anything about the Selma to Montgomery March, this is the church from which the marchers moved. Tabernacle, designed and built by an emancipated person, as far as we know, had no formal architectural training, and it is the most glorious building. So when you come, because I know you're all coming, be sure to see Tabernacle. These are examples of 3 private homes that are part of the consortium. The Sherrod Jackson Museum is the home where Dr. King stayed when he was in Selma. The Matthew and Emma Jackson Freedom Complex housed the SNCC workers who worked on voting in Lowndes County, which was a very dangerous assignment, and really birthed the Black Panther Party. The symbol of the Freedom Party was the Black Panther. And the Safe House in Greensboro, Alabama, was where Dr. King was sheltered from a mob that was attempting to kill him 2 weeks before he was assassinated in Memphis. And so, all of these stories have been the basis for archival research. I had to introduce you to Georgette Norman, our project historian, who is the person who's really digging through all of these materials. Our initial efforts have focused on identifying and collecting materials that are in the public record, and this is an example of one of the maps that she has been able to uncover. This is a newspaper article from the New York Times that talks about when President McKinley spoke at Old Ship. He next went to meet the colored people at Old Ship, where a great throng received him enthusiastically. But these are stories that nobody knows about, or that you hear about but haven't been documented in any way. One of the things that we've done with support from Kaplan is provide archival materials for all of our sites, and this is a beginning. This is a process of helping people to understand that their history is important and worth preserving, and encouraging them to find those, the church secretary or the usher or the preacher or the preacher's wife who took all the old programs home, and they're up in the attic or down in the basement, and then they pass and their children are like, what's all this old stuff? And they throw it out. So we're trying to help them identify, preserve it before that happens. And of course now, in 2019, we're really looking at digitization, and fortunately for us, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute has always had an active archives and archival program and oral history program. They're in the midst of a digitization effort, and we're able to be a part of that effort. The documentation has also connected us with university students, so it serves that role of engaging a new generation. These are students from Columbia University, again, with Will Reynolds from Kaplan. Tuskegee University has a brand spanking new historic preservation program as part of its School of Architecture, and this is one of those students doing hand drawings, architectural drawings at Dexter Avenue King Parsonage. And this past June, those students also led a historic preservation workshop at Tuskegee that was attended by our consortium site representatives, as well as young people from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, 16th Street Baptist Church, and Bethel. And they were phenomenal. The future of historic preservation is in good hands. I want you to know they were fabulous. Another important part of the documentation was photography by the National Park Service as part of their Historic American Building Survey. They hired a photographer named Jared Ortiz out of 5,000 applicants. Can you believe that? And he's referred to in some articles as the next Ansel Adams. Jared was fabulous. This is Jared on the left, Will on the right. Will might as well move to Alabama. He used large format photography to do architectural photographs of all of the sites. At this time, we did not realize that we were the guinea pigs. This was the first series of photographs that Jared did. And what I tell people is once you come, we've got you. So Jared came back several months later with his mother and his girlfriend because the people at Tabernacle had invited him to come back. And here are, again, Tuskegee students who also worked with Jared on the photography. This is Tabernacle. This is the church that invited Jared back, and he came when they did a reenactment, and you can see him in the center. This is the difference between the Habs photography that Jared did and a really excellent professional photograph, but you can see the difference in the detail. And when you see these, they look like paintings. We do not have all of them yet. We're waiting. They keep Jared on the road. But it's really an amazing collection of photographs that will be available, accessible, and usable by the public. And then our major oral history project, our major project that was launched here in New York in October by the World Monuments Fund and was developed in collaboration with the World Monuments Fund, is Voices of Alabama. And that's a collection of oral history from each of the sites, with the exception of one where we have a family illness. These are, you know, people always say these were ordinary people creating extraordinary change, but I think these people were pretty extraordinary, that they were willing to put literally their lives and their livelihood at risk to move our country forward toward equality and justice. And so, these are the behind the scenes photographs. The inset is Athena Richardson. Athena is our operations manager for the project. She handled all of the logistics. If you can, I showed you how far apart these places are, and if you can imagine the task of identifying the interviewees, being sure the building was open, being sure the interviewees were there, and that our videographer was also in place. This was in collaboration with Alabama Public Television. That's Georgette, pausing with Nelson Malden. Mr. Malden is known as Dr. King's barber. His barbershop, Malden Brothers, is in the historic Benmore Hotel. And Georgette stepped in and actually conducted most of the interviews after our interviewer was not able to do it because of illness in the family. And it turned out to be a blessing in disguise because her depth of knowledge of the places and the people and the stories led her to ask just the right questions. As you know, with oral history interviews, the questions are often as important as the interviewee. More behind the scenes. And so we've been in the midst of a strategic planning process because this project has grown beyond anything we could have imagined. You know, when I stepped into this role, we're going to do a needs assessment, pull everybody back together, September 17, we'd be finished. And as you see, that is not the case. And these are the things that our, the firm that we work with, Choir Consulting, I guess the big overview of what the consortium is now. And they did interviews with site representatives, partners, funders, and they all agree that the consortium matters. This was in the response to the question of what happens if the consortium goes away. And the resounding answer was the consortium should not go away. And our 5 core strengths have been creating community from a group of people who really never talked to each other, has now emerged this energetic, enthusiastic, collaborative network of individuals who share information and resources, preserving spaces. As you may or may not know, the National Park Service Civil Rights Fund under Historic Preservation has been the major source of funding for real construction work to preserve civil rights sites, and our sites have been very successful and have identified other resources. Protecting stories, this is really important. Civil rights tourism has become hot. You know, we've been discovered. But who tells those stories and who benefits from those stories is really key. And our sites are very concerned that the stories be told accurately. Teaching and learning, we've done a lot of workshops and training, but one of the most exciting things has been the fact that these sites learn from each other. It's just been marvelous to see that. And then expanding the table. As one of our site representatives said, they had, you know, gotten and applied for the historic designation and done all of the right things, but they still weren't present. They still weren't recognized. They still weren't part of the conversation. And what the consortium has done through the support of our fabulous partners here in New York has helped to bring them to the table. So they actually have a seat when there are conversations about preservation, about civil rights tourism, about how we save and promote this history and these stories. And I want to leave you with this trailer from Voices of Alabama. Invite you to go to the website, voicesofalabama.org, to learn and hear more about these civil rights sites and the Alabama African American Civil Rights Heritage Sites Consortium. Thank you so much.
We were all in darkness.
There were killings and lynchings.
We had to walk through throngs of white men on horseback with all kinds of weapons.
I thought as a teenager, who would bomb a church? The light started right up in that pulpit.
The movement consumed our church 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
1948, the first library for blacks started in this building.
And they loaded the Freedom Riders onto the truck and brought them here.
The Women's Political Council, it got its start here.
We haven't really told the story to our children, that there was just so much that happened before the bridge.
We needed something positive that you could see.
We need not only to preserve it, but we need to teach it to those who come after us.
I'm going to thank Priscilla for what is an incredibly modest introduction to what the Alabama African American Civil Rights Sites Consortium has done. I have only known Priscilla for 2.5 years. I had the great privilege when I was still an employee of World Monuments Fund to work on the Voices of Alabama project. And I will say, go to the website and watch any selection of those videos. They're all about 3 minutes long, so it's not a huge time commitment, but it will overwhelm you with a slice of history that you may think you know about, but in fact you don't. And I want to just say one last thing before I see if Brent and Priscilla have some final comments for us. And to say that when it was nominated to the World Monuments Watch, one of the pitches was the civil rights movement is not what we think it was. It was not the 1950s and 60s, that it actually began the day the Civil War ended, and it was 100 years of a fight, and it was a real movement. And when Priscilla said that those were extraordinary people, they were extraordinary people with extraordinary parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, friends of the movement. And I will say that because of the project, I went to Alabama a number of times, and every time I talked to people and met more people and visited more of the sites, I realized that we could make 300 videos instead of the 20 that we were able to do with the funding we had, because the stories are endless and it enriches all of our lives to understand this piece of history more profoundly. So I really can't thank Priscilla enough for not only coming to New York and getting up very early, but just giving us an introduction to this material. And with that, with the opportunity to have both of them here, I'd love to take a few questions from the audience, but also ask them if they have any final comments.
Preservation happens because of partnerships. How many individuals in here has preserved a nationally significant place by yourself? The reason that I say that is the work of the consortium is creating new forms of partnership, interpretation, and community. The emerging partnerships with the World Monuments Fund, the Kaplan Fund, and so many others is making the critical investment in helping to strengthen our democracy and reconcile our racist past. Their work is setting a foundation for the future of statewide preservation and will honor the full contributions of African Americans in civil rights, and most importantly, help to tell the story of Black activism, achievement, and community. So I want to challenge you today to explore how you can partner with the consortium, how you can invest in their future, and ensure that Alabama's civil rights legacy is forever remembered, and those historic assets stand in their fullest glory on the American cultural landscape.
You see why I let Brent make closing comments first. I was trying to think what I didn't say. One of the things I didn't say was that there is an urgency to collecting these stories. Two of our interviewees have passed since we did these, so those were the last interviews that they did. And one who we are just anxious to get his story, Mr. Jackson from the Jackson SNCC Freedom Complex is very ill. And as Lisa said, there's so many other stories. So we are really working to figure out how we can collect more of those stories pretty quickly before we lose those valuable individuals. And we are also working to put the consortium sites within their community context. I talked about the history being erased from memory, but also the reality is that many of these communities have been removed from the physical landscape. They are no longer there. And an important part of our archival work, Georgette uses the term evidence, to have evidence of these places that we can no longer see, and to tell these stories within the full community context. Because, you know, when you don't see it, it's easy to assume it didn't exist. And I have a confession. I'll confess to you Many of us grew up with this story, this mythology about after integration, black people went to all the white businesses because everybody thought that was better. What I missed was the reality that urban renewal and the construction of the federal highway system destroyed black business districts. So they weren't there. They weren't available anymore. So this is a learning process for me as well, and I think I'm steeped in African American history. So it's so important on so many levels. And we're telling the Alabama story, but the Alabama story is an American story and a universal story. So I appreciate you being here to hear a little bit about that.
I think in the interest of time and trying to get everybody out on time, we'll take 2 questions, and then I will encourage you all to go to the website and be in touch with any of us if you do have any more follow-up questions. So 2 questions from the audience.
I'd love to take my children on a civil rights tour. You said that you think it's important that it's told by the right people. So what are resources for me to find those right people?
We are now collaborating with the Alabama Civil Rights Tourism Association, brand new, and I'll be happy to connect you. The focus, this is another interesting partnership, but the focus is to really be sure that the story is told accurately, either by people who lived it or people who have learned it. So I'll be happy to share some information with you.
Well, I will also, yes, Roberta?
In the areas that you said have been demolished, is there any intent to mark here schools, those individual place schools as well?
The question is about markers are ways to tell the stories of those places that no longer exist. Yes. Our Department of Tourism loves to put up markers. Places that don't exist. But at the same time, particularly in Montgomery, there's a real effort around creative placemaking with artists, some younger artists in the community, particularly an area called the Peacock Tract. And, I'm sorry, I just had what Janetta Cole calls a little senior, Centennial Hill. I got it, Centennial Hill and the Peacock Tract, to look at how to activate those places and how to retell those stories. So we're working on it. Markers get put up, then they get defaced, and they, kind of fade away, and if there isn't advocacy to have them replaced. And even with a marker, it doesn't really capture the vitality and the significance of a whole community, particularly Peacock Tract. The expressway wiped out a whole professional black residential community and business community. And the same thing happened in Birmingham around Old Sardis. Selma is more rural, so it's a different kind of devastation, if you will, in those communities. So the short answer to your question is yes, there have been limited signage put up, and we are working to increase the visibility of those communities.
So yes, last question.
I have to get on your side. If I wanted to say everything totally, is there an online curriculum or can someone buy an online communication? So you can watch these archives and have discussion about it. Because most children today, they're reading on the civil rights movement is, Martin Luther King was a great man.
Yeah. All right, as I say, Rosa Parks sat down, Dr. King stood up, and all was right with the world. We are just building an archives, and we are launching a youth leadership program that will include curriculum development, but that's not ready yet. But the Alabama Department of Education does have a website. I'm just trying to remember whether it's accessible to people outside of Alabama, and I'm not sure. I'll give you a card. And then the Encyclopedia of Alabama and the Alabama Department of Archives and History also have some limited lessons, and the Southern Poverty Law Center, is a great resource as well.
So I'm afraid we have to wrap up. I will make one plug, which is Congresswoman Terry Sewell was mentioned this morning, and she's really been a linchpin in galvanizing federal funding for many African-American civil rights sites. So while this is an apolitical breakfast, I will make the political statement to say, whoever you vote for, when we vote for people, our voice can also have a great impact on where funding goes. So the more we understand this history and the more we understand the need for funding, while the private sector steps in and does a great deal, in this instance, there's been tremendous federal funding, and we really need to support our elected officials who take the chance on preservation as a catalyst for education and economic improvement and social cohesion. So, with that, I'm going to thank our speakers once again and thank Otis for being our honoree this morning. Many of us have known Otis a long time, and it's a great honor to be in his presence anytime, but especially this morning. So I want to thank everybody for coming. And thank the board of the New York Preservation Archive Project and the benefit committee this morning, and especially the Kaplan Fund and Greenwood Cemetery and Friends of Otis for being very important supporters for us this morning, as well as all of you for coming. And it never can get more exciting than our Preservation Archive Bard Breakfast. So a new feature is we were given this lovely book, Bricks and Brownstones, to give to a randomly selected attendee this morning. And so, here's a great example of archives in action that can produce such a beautiful book. And the winner to take home this book is Dwayne Watson. Once again, thank you everybody for coming. Have a wonderful holiday season, and see you next year at the Bar Breakfast.